a big hello to everybody. I say everybody because I can see we already have over 70 people joining this session this lunchtime, with more adding as I speak, actually. So welcome. Hi, everybody. I hope everybody is dry and warm. I don't know about you where you are, but it is pretty miserable in Somerset at the moment. Lots of flooding and road closures. But hopefully we're all nice, warm and dry, and looking forward to this lovely session with Ben. So today's session, it forms part of the National Plant Monitoring Scheme training series and engagement series. This is a little bit different because we are now into sort of our winter mini series, as we are calling it. So we tend to offer something a little bit different throughout the winter months to keep us active and busy and engaged. So we're actually talking today, or I should say Ben is talking today, about something a little bit different for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. We're talking about disturbed and the vegetation, of disturbed and urban places. So really looking forward to this session with Ben. So yes, welcome to all our NPMS volunteers, but similarly, welcome to anybody who isn't currently involved with the NPMS. Please do take a look at our website if you haven't, and find out if you might like to get involved in volunteering with us. Thank you ever so much, and I shall let Ben crack on and share his presentation with you all.
Okay, so this, let's make sure, yeah, it is the right one. Okay, so hello, and thanks for coming along to this session, and for thanks to NPMS folks for having me do this. Well, all these talks, it's been great to do them. And this one, yeah, it's a bit of a different one because all the other ones have been kind of really about particular habitats that people do NPMS work in. So there's been a particular need to help people classify things to the particular habitat type, and I've been discussing what it is about this or that habitat and so on. But these kind of more disturbed and urban places are not really NPMS habitats, so it's a little bit kind of more informal in that way, and just something for interest's sake. And there's an introductory page here, outline page thing, with bullet points for the main things, that the main sort of sequence order in which we're going to be looking at things. What I've done here is I've actually put together a presentation of stuff that's looking at, firstly, a very kind of brief look at disturbance, elements of disturbance in more kind of natural stroke semi-natural kind of habitats, because obviously when we think of disturbed and urban places, what must be coming to mind for all you folks is probably more on the urban side, urban industrial artificial kind of habitats. But yeah, I thought I'd put a little bit in about disturbance in more semi-natural habitats as well, because it does, and there's kind of links between the two, ecologically and floristically. So a little bit about that first, and then going into look at artificial disturbance in semi-natural habitats, and then artificial disturbance creating more artificial habitats, the more kind of really disturbed and urban industrial kind of places. So that's the sequence, basically going from more rural and more kind of natural to the with increasing gradient of artificiality in a way to end up with the more kind of artificial urban then things. And there's another title page I did with a nice example of something that's disturbed and urban there. And that's got the same list of things, different elements of it that I'm going through the same list that was on a couple of pages back there. And as I said just here, this is not meant to be a sort of very detailed technical reference. It's just a general look at things. And there's such a big range of these disturbed and urban habitats, partly for geographical reasons. Some species do better in the south, and you get things down there that you don't get up here in Scotland. And a lot of odd variation of plant species becoming very abundant in some place, just probably because of chance. So there's a huge amount of variation, much more than I or anybody really could do in a presentation like this. So this presentation has got a lot of photos in it that are mainly from up here in Scotland, because that's where I live, that's where most of my work is. And so it's especially the central belt of Scotland. I've got a lot of ones from urban and industrial places in the central belt. But yeah, firstly, looking at the more natural kind of habitats, the more kind of natural physical disturbance that we get. there's just a few examples of this. Water flow along rivers. Things can be continually changing along lots of rivers, both in the uplands and in the lowlands as well, with erosion and deposition because of the water flow. So materials being eroded, materials being sort of deposited. So affecting things, plant species that grow there, got to deal with that. And we also have the actual effect of stream water directly on the rocks, which has quite an interesting effect. If we look at fast flowing streams and rivers in upland areas, especially, the actual water action directly on the rocks prevents a lot of the bigger mosses and liverworts and vascular plants from being able to get a foothold on there. They keep getting washed off. And that's actually very good news for a lot of little tiny western oceanic mosses and liverworts that like to grow in these sort of places, and a lot of them are pretty uncommon. There's an example of one there, Coelolegionia microscopica, a little tiny thing that grows on steep rocks in very, very humid places. So water action can have a pretty big effect on the flora along rocky streams and rivers. Water along the coast obviously has big effects. Waves pounding there at the cliffs, eroding them away, and the sea coming up and down with the tides. Oh, big, elements, different elements of disturbance there. And it can do things like it can affect the water course. There's an example there as part of an art project I did about some sand dunes in Sutherland, looking at the variation over the years in the actual location of where the stream went across the sand. Sort of elements of disturbance there affecting the whole habitat. It's just natural kind of disturbance. Wind as well, actually on the coast as well, in the same sort of places, wind shaping those sand dunes, ongoing kind of instability of a kind, quite natural, perfectly natural. And up on the hills, frequent strong wind has a big effect on the vegetation, both in terms of its structure, kind of preventing it from getting very tall and preventing it from having complete coverage on the ground, and the flora, the species mix as well. You can get some quite interesting little montane plants being able to grow where it's kept open by the harshness of that climate, including the windiness. So elements of disturbance affecting the flora in a natural way. And wind also can blow trees down, and there again, when this happens naturally, of course, and that it has a role there in the development of vegetation, different sort of stages, different cycles and things. So when the big tree blows down there on that root plate, you can get exposed soil in a place where there might not otherwise be very much of that. And that's a good place for lots of little mosses to grow, at least temporarily, and gradually some small vascular plants getting in there. So that one on the left, that was in the Lake District. I was actually in that wood doing a survey of mosses and liverworts on the occasion when that tree blew down. I saw it actually being blown down. It's a big oak tree. It was really pretty scary. The wind was howling. And as I walked past that tree, only a few minutes before it blew over, I remember thinking, well, big trees like that might be a kind of place where you could stand feeling a little bit more safe while all these thinner ones were blowing around. But it was an absolute hell of a strong wind. And then, a few minutes later, I was up by this rock and there's this huge noise, and I look around and that very same tree was being blown over. And the one on the right, that's some of the results of Storm Arwen, which came with a strong northerly wind and blew lots of trees down, especially in conifer plantations. And I kind of look at those and think it'd be great if they just left a lot of those there, because it's a kind of tangle of stuff that is pretty impenetrable. And it conforms, I've written there, a kind of new wild. There's the concept of wild is quite a variable one. There's elements of wild all over the place in different forms. Okay, unstable ground, but just where it's so steep, stones and things falling down, soil creep going on because it's steep, and also very high up, slowly fluctuating terraces with freeze-thaw action. All these things, elements of disturbance happening quite naturally and affecting the vegetation in all sorts of ways. So those are all natural things. Artificial disturbance firstly, in relatively natural or semi-natural kind of habitats out in countryside, in the hills and things, we see a lot of this, especially in peaty places. There's lots of disturbance to the soils there that has really major effects on the whole environment there. In peatlands, draining, there's some examples there, draining and mounding and peat extraction. We have terrible effects, obviously, that has, not just from the point of view of the vegetation. It releases carbon when we don't want that to be happening. And the one in the middle, mounding, people shouldn't really be planting trees on deep peat, but they have been doing in quite a lot of places, and they've been, because it's not such a good habitat for trees to be planted in, to get the trees growing. They dig a hole and they put the peat just by it, so it'll be a bit drier, and they put the tree in. And then as the vegetation grows taller, which it always will, because they're going to put a fence around these places to stop the deer coming in and eating the young trees, then those holes get hidden. And as you walk across there, your foot suddenly goes down because you can't see those holes, and you probably won't even know that there are young trees there, because in a lot of these places the soil it's actually such a poor habitat for planting young trees that they don't grow properly. And some years afterwards, it just looks like an ordinary bit of bog or wet heath on deep peat. Really not very good places to walk over because of those holes. So that's those effects on deep peat. Forestry. Obvious disturbance here, ploughing and planting the place up in the first place would have probably previously been some kind of heath, in some cases actually directly from native woodland. I mean, shouldn't really be doing that, and hopefully shouldn't be happening anymore. And then when it's felled, sudden disturbance, and then after that kind of disturbance, you can have a sort of temporary abundance of certain plant species that do very well where conditions are opened out and competition with other plants is not very high. Species that otherwise, if they they wouldn't do so well in sort of establishing themselves within a thick, dense sward. So wavy hairgrass is one. You can get a sudden sort of boom of that, and rosebay willowherb very conspicuously, especially when it's in flower. And soft rush, which is very common in all sorts of habitats, but it can get particularly abundant where there's been some disturbance of various kinds, including the felling of conifer plantations. So a kind of temporary change or development of vegetation of a kind that's not set to last really for a really long time. Gradually, slowly but surely, other things will colonize, and the vegetation will develop towards maybe some kind of heath or grassland or scrubby woodland. Another thing that we find in some of these conifer plantations is interesting things along the forest tracks, partly because of disturbance, keeping the conditions rather on the open side, which can give room for plants, again, that are not very good competitors with others, like the one on the right there, the heath cudweed. It's a pretty uncommon species, and the edges of forest tracks are one of its best habitats, actually, quite an important habitat for it. And the picture on the left is an example of how we can find a neutral grassland sward developing in an area that's otherwise really got very acid soils. I think this is because often they brought in some stone from elsewhere to build up the track, and the stone's been not quite so acid as the actual bedrock there and the native sort of soils. But you can get some really quite herb-rich, nice and colourful, neutral grassland swards developing along the sides of some of these forest tracks in otherwise acid upland areas. Burning, artificial major disturbance thing affecting lots of heaths and bogs, even it has done, which is not very good. Obviously has a big sort of suppression effect on the vegetation in terms of its structure and its flora, really. A lot of species can't really tolerate that burning, especially if it's severe or regular. So it really does change things. And again, the wavy hairgrass is an example of a species that after it's been burned and got a lot more space, that it can thrive better than before because of open space, less competition, and you get a sort of burst of that for a while. If you're in the far southwest of Britain, southwest England and the extreme south of Wales, there's quite an uncommon, nationally uncommon, but locally common grass, other kind of grass, Agrostis curtisii, the bristle bent, which can behave in a rather similar way, can kind of take off, increase in abundance for a while after there's been some burning in these acid, rather peaty places. But overall, I think there's a lot of negative stuff happening from a lot of burning on places like ground smogs. And then there's things like the effect of deer trampling, where especially on peatland, very kind of major effect. And well, it's done by deer. It's not done directly by people, but it is indirectly done by us in that we've removed long ago. We've taken out the big apex predators, wolves and things, and that's helped the numbers of deer to increase to an unnatural high density. And also we brought in livestock as well in many places. The photos here of a place where there aren't any livestock, but in many places there are a mix of various combinations of sheep and deer up in the hills on peaty soils, causing a lot of erosion. So that's an example of it being indirectly artificial. Has pretty major effects. In bogs, it's really pretty bad carbon release, among other things. So, and so some more of these species, a closer view there of wavy hairgrass, one of those species that does very well after that kind of disturbance, whether it be conifer felling or burning. And also common cotton grass. That's one of the pioneer things that can do quite well. I mean, it's in a lot of the vegetation anyway. It's in a lot of the more semi-natural bog vegetation, but it can be one of the pioneers to get going where peat has been exposed after some kind of disturbance. And bulbous rush is another one on the right, a smaller plant, spreading quite big there. It often grows really very small, but where the peat's been exposed, some of these things can form quite big plants, again because of the lack of competition with other plants, freedom from competition. And when we look at the mosses in some of these places, we find some differences with places that are not so disturbed. This Campylopus introflexus on the left, which is a non-native species, it's quite a nice looking thing, but if you see a lot of that around, it tends to suggest there's been some disturbance, which could be various things. It could be things like that mounding, peat cutting, the edges of drains, trampling, excessive trampling by large herbivores, burning. So a lot of that is rather a negative indicator in places like heaths and bogs. And likewise, Polytrichum commune, which is very, very common moss in all sorts of wet, acid places, occurring quite naturally in lots of habitats, but in great abundance in peaty places like bogs and wet heaths. It's more of a kind of sign of some kind of disturbance because it doesn't occur naturally in very great quantities in those places. So that seems to take off where there's been some direct ground disturbance. Okay, now moving away from those more sort of very definitely kind of rural and semi-natural kind of habitats into ones that are a bit more obviously artificially disturbed from things like industry and agriculture. So a wide range of kind of habitats, species, kind of vegetation types, mixtures of plant species, very, very varied from things around the edges of fields right through to urban and industrial places. So one thing just to start with this is to make mention of the fact that we can find wherever we see these sorts of artificial disturbances, we tend to be able to recognize a gradient of variation from places, bits of ground that have been very recently disturbed or are currently being disturbed, or maybe ongoing disturbance of some kind, and they tend to be quite bare with nothing much more than a very patchy and short cover of vegetation. Compared with, on the other hand, places that have been disturbed but then left, and their vegetation's grown taller and often quite thicker as well, quite different looking. And you can get the two side by side as they are here, and even closer than that, just along the edges of paths, for example, all sorts of places. They can occur in mosaics or in strips alongside each other, but it's very common. And they can both have mixtures of species that are indicative of the disturbance, whether it be ongoing current disturbance or disturbance from a wee while ago that's left its mark, at least for a while, in a mixture of certain plant species that are not the kind of things we will get in a place that hadn't been so disturbed. Here are some species that are kind of like pioneer plants among the many little pioneer plants that we find in otherwise fairly bare bits of ground, common plants for the most part. I put a moss there as well, included because little mosses will colonize these places. That one at the bottom right, the field horsetail, growing in tarmac. That was a funny one. That was a place in Northern Ireland where we were staying in some self-catering accommodation when we were doing some work over there, and they got at the edge of their place, they got a big wall and a gate. We saw quite a lot of these over there, actually. Gates, an entrance gate with big pillars on the side, and there was an electric thing for letting yourself in, and a thing there saying about a dog, that there was a fierce dog there. You kind of think, what the hell's going on here? You think, is this somebody really famous, or is it some kind of criminal or something? That's what I would think over here anyway. We see something like that, but there were a lot of them over there. But it struck me as being quite funny because they'd gone to all this trouble to keep things out, keep stuff out, but they couldn't stop that wee horsetail from growing over this tarmac. They tarmacked over virtually the whole of the front of this place, big extensive tarmac. But yeah, they couldn't stop that wee little horsetail from creeping up through it. So those would be pioneer things, little ones. And then some examples of common taller ones that we get where it's been disturbed and then left for a while. Rosebay willow herb, lovely plant. Ground elder, can grow quite tall and lush. And bramble is very common species, but that often is associated with past disturbance followed by a period of kind of neglect. Arable field margins, a few photographs of some examples of these. A nice kind of habitat, really. Of course, the fields themselves, in the middle of the fields, be subject to much more kind of ongoing big disturbance, but the edges rather less so. So you can get quite interesting mixtures of little, what people think as weedy plants, but they're quite beautiful little things. And where they've been given a fair bit of space after that kind of initial disturbance, they can grow quite big and sort of like rosettes of things like that thistle on the lower left. Quite a nice little assemblage of these species here. Very colourful when some of them are in flower. Here's some close-ups of some of the kind of typical species of arable field margins. Mostly quite small plants, little things that you'd find growing beneath the edges of the actual crop as well as that's growing. But some of them are a bit taller, like the poppies. But another small one there is scarlet pimpernel, which we find up here occasionally around the edges of some arable fields. It's quite an uncommon species this far north, so it's always quite an exciting find. And I've seen it in a few places around here in East Lothian. And actually also more naturally, I've seen it on the coast of the West Highlands, on the island of Mull, in places that are again very disturbed, more naturally so, by sea and wind just at the edges of the beach. But this is an example in the arable field margin habitat. Some more species that we get in the arable field margins: chickweed, small nettle. Small nettle, I've seen in at least one of the books somewhere saying that it doesn't sting as badly as ordinary nettle. I don't believe that. I've had some pretty nasty stings from small nettle. So don't be complacent about it. And some more of these things: creeping thistle, ordinary stinging nettle, broadleaf dock, and pineapple weed. It's a lovely looking plant. I do like pineapple weed. Some of these things, little weeds, people often use the word weed. It sounds kind of negative very often, but they're beautiful plants, all of them. Yeah, I like pineapple weed. The smell of those, if you squeeze those little yellow flower things. Okay, so there's a few things of arable field margins. Roadsides all around the country going well inland. We can find some coastal species in some places growing there that have been brought along there, with sort of seeds brought along by vehicles and helped by the spraying of salts. which then limits competition with other kinds of plants. Most species of plants that we get won't really tolerate so much salt. So Danish scurvy grass and lettuce sea spurry have spread well inland, especially along roads. Here's a couple of other examples. In Perthshire, I found a few stands of tor grass, Brachypodium pinnatum, which is a really southern species. And it was an area where there is some limestone. So one might think, oh, wow, limestones, because it likes limestone down south. But actually right by the road, that's the A9 there, it'll be sort of seeds and things caught in car tires and somehow deposited by the road. But it's still a nice, exciting thing to find a big patch of that. And then some hawkweed dock's tongue, that other picture there. It's an example of just something growing by the side of the road, again, where there's a nice balance there, I suppose, of freedom from competition to a certain degree, because it's kept open enough, with just enough disturbance for that, but also not quite enough disturbance to stop something growing for a reasonable length of time, getting quite big, and a little sort of zone of fairly well developed vegetation growing along the edge of that road. That's down south on the England-Wales border. So roadsides, arable field margins, quarries. Another place where you can get different kinds of disturbance, obviously huge disturbance when they've taken the rock down straight away immediately, but then gradually things will develop, and on the base of the quarry floor it's a different kind of disturbance, different substrates, different like smaller stones, and a lot of kind of ongoing disturbance in quarry floors that can be in keeping the vegetation cover limited to being very sparse and short. So all kinds of interesting things you can find there. This one near Edinburgh had a very rich flora. I was doing a survey there, and among other things, there was some population of mossy stonecrop, which is very rare up here. I think that had probably been brought in by vehicles, most likely. Vehicle use associated with the quarrying, but still it's a nice little thing to find. Probably doesn't look much. Somebody might look at that and think, oh, it doesn't look very interesting, but no, it does. Doesn't have to be all big and fancy. Buddleia is, though, I suppose that's an attractive looking plant, and that does very, very well in some of these quarry habitats and lots of other places where there's been some kind of disturbance, and even disturbance that is rather ongoing as well. So it must not do so well for competing with other plants in more closed vegetation, even though it can grow into quite a vigorous looking bush. But it's a good disturbance indicator, a very prominent one, easy to spot, easy to identify. This is a quarry in the Central Belt that has been left. Well, actually, it was converted to a reservoir after a while, being first a quarry, then the reservoir. And then the reservoir was drained, so it's been through quite a lot of disturbance, after which it's had enough time, quite a few decades, for vegetation to develop, which has included some very nice herb-rich grassland with a lot of quaking grass, northern marsh orchid there, and loads of sedges. A very, very fine bit of habitat, really, in this old quarry. It's actually a nature reserve. It's a more general view of that same place. Some oxeye daisy growing there. It's a good flora. And in what was the base of the quarry and then the bottom of the reservoir, since it was all drained, it's now developed some really pretty good fen and swamp vegetation. Here's a load of bottle sedge and water horsetail. Really very, very fine site. And we'll cite in both sense SITE and SIGHT. And you know, I suppose there's been disturbance and then vegetation developing again. You never know what's going to come in at what stages, and it might be that the chance occurrence of something at a certain stage has put it in a good position to become really abundant, as we see with this hairy sedge, Carex hirta. We don't normally see loads and loads of this species forming a dominant kind of sward, but here it was. Okay, this is a quarry, an old quarry on the England-Wales border, in limestone area. actually. So there's a more southern flora down there with some salad burnet at the very bottom of the left-hand photo, and some yellowworts, quite striking plants. Quite exciting thing to see. We don't really see it up here. We have a few dots for it on the map, but it's really a more southern plant. So yeah, you can get all sorts of interesting things in old quarries. Another kind of disturbance that you get in mainly kind of rural areas can be these old mines that you get scattered through the hills in places like the North Pennines, where there's old lead mines, and there's lots of them in Wales as well, and some parts of Scotland too. And they can have an interesting flora, as we see here in this one of old mine spoil in Upper Teesdale. Upper Teesdale is a brilliant place for plants anyway. There's loads of limestone and all kinds of interesting upland species, some of them very rare. And it's got lots of these little patches of old mine spoil with lots of spring sandwort, among other species, growing there. So very distinctive flora. It's quite interesting stuff. Distinctive enough to have its own national vegetation classification plant community as well. OV37 is very much focused mainly in these sorts of places. So they're quite interesting. Here's one in Wales, the site where I was doing a survey of mosses, actually. It doesn't look, some people might say it doesn't look much, really. A bit of scrappy, bare, waste-looking ground. But it's got a good flora of mosses, including some quite uncommon species. The picture on the right shows quite a bit of moss growing in there. Here's some close-ups of some of them. The two on the right are not quite as common as the two on the left. It was good. A lot of these places can look, somebody might say they look quite dull and really quite bare with hardly any vegetation, but there can be a lot of stuff there, including species that are tolerant of the toxicity of the soils. That's the important thing that gives rise to the very particular floras that we get in these old mine sites with this old mine spoil. The soil is too toxic for most species to grow, but a few then that are not very common and that can't take much competition among plants, they can do well there because the other plants can't grow there because it's too poisonous. Another interesting effect I noticed at this same place in Wales was some little tiny sprigs of bilberry, Vaccinium myrtillus, growing absolutely tiny. So I took a photograph. I took two photos, one with the pencil and another one with the hand lens. But pencils are a more familiar piece of kit than a hand lens, so it would probably mean more to more people comparing the size of the pencil. So it's the size of not just a moss, but a small moss, that Vaccinium, absolutely minute little thing.
Thanks, Task. We've got a quick question about that. Somebody has asked, would those habitats come under a Calmanarian grassland?
Oh, they would. The OV37 one, yes, it does.
Great, thank you.
OV37 does overlap with that. Yes. There's a recognised, is it an Annex 1 or a UK baptized? Yeah, there is that.
Am I okay to ask another quick question? Another one we've got here. I just thought it was easier to ask while we were talking about these. Are the very red leaves common where plants grow in this disturbed environment? Somebody has noted they've seen dandelion with very red leaves on an old quarry spoil. So we wondered if there was a link there.
Yeah, it could be, but actually Blaeberry has red leaves quite naturally in all sorts of places, perhaps especially where the soil is getting a bit thinner. But I'm not sure if it would be that strongly. You do get them in places where it's not just a kind of heavy metal toxic kind of soil. I think maybe where it's generally getting a bit more stressed. Trying to think off the top of my head where you get things with that go red where the soil isn't so thin. It's very often in places where the soil is really just thin and poor and nutrients availability is on the low side. So I think that observation you described does kind of match. I think it's rather consistent with that. And I've seen Blaeberry growing really very red in places where the soil, as far as we understand, is not a toxic one. It's just kind of very poor. But I think at that place where I took the photo with a pencil, being a very thin, stony soil, and also with heavy metal content is sort of double sort of problem for it. And yeah, but I don't know entirely. I can't give 100% answer about exactly why these things go red and in different places. Yeah, I've got a selection of photos here from these industrial places in the central belt of Scotland, where there's been a lot of industry in the past, but then it's discontinued, stopped. And an example of some of these shale bings that we have in West Lothian. I live in East Lothian, but I've been doing quite a bit of work in West Lothian, it's the other side of Edinburgh, and they're fascinating places. They really are. They've been left really for quite a lot of time, but you can see the soil actually isn't good for a lot of plants and for sort of thick vegetation to develop, at least not very quickly, because a lot of them can stay quite open and bare looking for a very long time. But the plants that you do get on there can be really very interesting ones. This site up near sort of towards Linlithgow, there's a whole population of this thing called great lettuce, which it's the first time I'd ever seen it. It's more common down south, and at first I thought that must be something alien that's coming there. It's just the kind of place for some alien species to do very well because of lack of competition. But no, it's actually a native species, a huge, great thing, growing up to about a couple of meters tall, some of them. That's quite an exciting find. There's also big clumps of deadly nightshade there, which is not native up this far north. And the little groundsel, sticky groundsel, I think some of the sticky groundsel can do quite well, and the heath groundsel can both do quite well on places that are kept open and disturbed. There's an interesting place that was partly wooded, the same bing here, and there was a lot of birch and goat willow was doing very well. Some really quite big goat willows growing there. This had been some decades since the place was last worked. And there's a lot of moss on the ground in different places, including lots of patches of this thing called Brachythecium glariosum, which looks very much like our very common Brachythecium retabulum. But I looked at it closer, it looks a bit different. It was Brachythecium glariosum, turned out to be the first record of that in West Lothian. And then not far from there, actually, there was a whole load of, or one little area with a load of spikes of yellow bird's nest, which is very rare up here. Growing on, this is in the woodland under the trees, but growing on this sort of rather stony soil. Exciting find. And in the same wood, I found one of these goat willows. I was just looking at these goat willows. They're beautiful trees. I really think the goat willow is one of the perhaps an underrated tree, just the growth form of it. And they can grow, reasonably quickly, and they can develop into good thick trunks, or, and in this case, multi-stemmed tree. And they can be good for things growing on them, as epiphytes. And I looked on this, and there were some little patches of Myriocoliopsis minutissima. Used to be called Coleogenia minutissima. Now we have to call it Myriocoliopsis. That's why I say it slowly, because every time I have to remember Myriocoliopsis. I can't remember what its English name is. Growing on this goat willow. It's a beautiful little thing. I've been looking for it in the Lothians, never finding it. Wondered if it would be here, and there it is. Its first record. So it was quite exciting to find. And there's been a lot of trees on these places that have been disturbed and then regrown with young woodland. It's been very exciting to see what comes up, because in the time those young trees have been growing has been in recent decades when sulfur dioxide pollution is nowhere near as bad as it used to be. So things that are coming in, spreading, some of them Western species like that Frulania liverwort and the Eulota calvescens moss and the Hypotrichina lichen. I saw a second site of that actually just a couple of days ago in another site in West Lothian. Great things turning up on trees, young trees in the central belt, in places that have, some of them in places that have been disturbed, other places not been so disturbed in the past, but they're young plantations. So there's a bit of overlap there with the kind of lack of disturbance side of things, but all quite exciting. And there's a photo of just a kind of mix of different stages, from the very bare and open pioneer stuff in the distance to taller, thicker stuff in the foreground with roseberry, willow herb, and woodland down on the right, developing, well, different stages of vegetation development. Nice mosaic of habitats there on this Bing. This is another Bing in West Lothian. Woodland that had developed here. We got a load of pines and young pines, and underneath there was absolutely loads of common wintergreen. It's called common wintergreen, but it's not really a common plant. I'm always very excited to see common wintergreen, and there was masses of it there. Again, I'm sure that's down to colonizing at a time when the ground was bare and open enough, and it could just spread with little competition, and there's still plenty of it. And it's also good for orchids, this place. All these orchid populations, there's 4 species there. And there were more species than that, but there are 4 photographs of different kinds there in the woods and adjacent grassland, all on this old Bing that's now quite well revegetated. It's a place called Foul Shields Bing. Might not sound a very nice name, but it's a wonderful place. It's a nature reserve as well. And here the vegetation had developed, and it looked kind of like it was more semi-natural looking, blaeberry with mosses under, as we usually have with blaeberry in mossy places. But there were different species of mosses. There were mosses of more kind of neutral soils compared with the more acidophilous mosses that we're used to seeing with blaeberry. So I thought, what's going on here? It must be something to do with particular nature of the soils on that old Bing, the disturbance and the mine spoil, sort of very, very different kind of soils, leading to this odd combination of blaeberry and different kinds of mosses. They're common mosses, but usually in very different habitats. Some photos of this Bing showing another one, 5 Sisters Bing in the distance. I've still never been to that one. It's a great looking landscape feature in West Lothian. And this is up on another one, a place called Whitrig Bing. Real mix of habitats there. It's a wonderful place. I was there a few months ago doing the survey for a day. Loads of lupins in one place. It's nice to see the load of lupins. They're obviously a non-native plant, but they look nice, and they're not being a real problem there. They're not invading it in a massive way and causing depletion of populations of other interesting plants. And the whole habitat is secondary anyway. So that's interesting to see. In this heath there with which is still not fully developed on the site, so the bits of bare ground and some club mosses. That's stag's horn club moss. In some of these Bings, there are also records of alpine club moss and fir club moss, which are more distinctly upland plants. So not very common in areas like the Central Belt, unless you're on some of these particularly previously disturbed habitats where there's some open conditions. And at the same site, another place got thickly vegetated with some very nice herb-rich grassland, beautiful stuff. Quite typical of what we call MG5 in the National Vegetation Classification. A lot of those typical neutral grassland, unimproved neutral grassland species, but also here it's a load of the St. John's wort, perforate St. John's wort, which does seem to do very well where there's been some disturbance. And here it's at a stage where the vegetation is that bit better developed, but still some of it there, quite a bit of it. I expect that species will gradually dwindle though as the vegetation thickens up and gets more fully developed. There's another one, Addywell Bing in West Lothian, very much more vegetated, this one. With woodland, partly conifer, partly broadleaved, and it's got a lot of tall, weedy vegetation, including roseberry, willow herb, and also the next pictures, bramble and raspberry. Those 2 species can do very well after there's been some initial disturbance, and then it's been left alone for a while. And as long as grazing is not too strong, because both of these, bramble and the raspberry, are very palatable to large herbivores. But they do well there, and the grazing hasn't been enough to prevent good growth of shrubs. Here's a load of hawthorn and broom. Broom is also very palatable to these animals, by the way. So it's nice to see all this vegetation, this tangle of stuff, which should be good habitat for birds and mammals and insects. There's a patch of iris developed there, a little stand of what we would call in National Vegetation Classification terms M28, which is mostly found on the West Highland coast, but crops up a bit more widely, even in an old Bing site in the Central Belt. There's Addiwell, Five Sisters being visible again in the distance. So this is not a Bing. This is an old. Well, no, it's not. It's ongoing disturbance really at this site. It's a landfill site going towards Glasgow, with herb-rich neutral grassland developing very extensively on it. Again, much like our standard unimproved neutral grassland, but a lot of coltsfoot leaves in the foreground. You can see that's a species that does do well where there's been some disturbance. Another effect is here's a site near Glasgow with a load of sand sedge, which is normally coastal, but it's become very abundant there, probably transported in by rail of some kind when there was an old workings there. I'm going through these a bit quicker now because I'm noticing we haven't got that much time. The same site near Glasgow had a load of the all-site clover, which you don't really see in huge quantity much generally, and red clover in massive quantity, the picture on the left, and loads of field horsetail on the right. Odd kinds of vegetation, like dominated by field horsetail or dominated by red clover, all down to previous disturbance, you know. And going into more definitely urban places, there's a good example of the real pioneer stage. It's not been allowed to get beyond that because it's just so ongoing, so much ongoing sort of disturbance. Some more examples of that. That's one on the left is actually in New York, a place where I took a photograph in Park Avenue, believe it or not. Again, nothing more than initial pioneer stage development on the left, whereas the one on the right is kind of much more thickly developed. That's on the edges of the Glasgow conurbation, some kind of untidy vegetation around the backs of some houses. It's disturbance followed by neglect. More urban scenes here. Oxford ragwort is quite a common thing you find along the edges of pavements, and as well as railways and all sorts of places, but in towns and cities it can be really quite common. All sorts of things can grow on otherwise bare looking ground. Here's some squirrel tail fescue, making do with what's a very limited amount of soil in there, but still it can survive. Some things that are more common down south can turn up here, probably not naturally this far north. The wild parsnip was quite exciting to see. Kind of looks a bit like hogweed, but not quite. So it was an exciting thing just on the edge of Edinburgh. Big stands of rosebay willow herb in lots of places where it's been disturbed along the edges of roads, and this is like on the edge of a business park. Been disturbed and then left. A lot of the disturbance, like the one on the left there, can give rise to quite a rich mix of all sorts of plants, some of which have maybe been planted nearby and expanded into there, or even planted right there and now got mixed up with native species that have come in, like the Yorkshire foggrass. They can often add in an interesting way to the environment, which is otherwise quite an artificial environment to such a degree anyway, that it's not like there's great loss thing. Whereas in a lot of more definitely wild places, non-native alien plant species can be a problem. An extreme example being rhododendron, as in the picture on the right, that's in the West Highlands. Huge problem because it gets into habitats that are otherwise proper native habitats of great interest. Some more real urban ones. This is in Glasgow. Old brownfield site revegetating with some interesting mixes of species, including the melilot and a patch of blunt-flowered rush. God knows how that got there. Some henbane, it's a poisonous plant. Found that on some waste ground in Dunbar. Beautiful looking thing though. That's all been built over now. So it's completely changing habitats. And the last picture has too, actually. Buddleia again in a very urban setting, and we often find buddleia growing on the tops or high up on buildings as well, where there's been enough degree of neglect, hasn't been sort of, people might think hasn't been looked after, but then the buddleia has been able to grow and doesn't need that much soil. And get in there in roofs and edges of little bits sticking out from the buildings. That was in Manchester, that one. I've only about once or twice ever been there. Blackpool, I was doing some survey work of some mosses in this place in Blackpool, a wood. Fascinating place to walk through this funny city of Blackpool. And there was this brick wall. We don't often see brick walls, red brick up here. So it was interesting to see a lot of that. And there was all these ferns growing just on an ordinary looking brick wall in the middle of Blackpool, or native fern species. So a certain element of artificiality about that environment, but native flora doing quite well. And mix of native and non-native things here in disturbed roadside urban places. Fern grass, that's not that common really. It's a nice thing to see. That Galingale is a nice looking plant, although it's not native. It's a sort of garden escape probably. And then a nice kind of mix of ferns and other plants growing on the picture on the right. It's placed in Ayrshire. Here's a few photos placed in Edinburgh where there was a load of non-native species, or some of them native but further south, all growing to form a nice looking assemblage. There's some lucerne, and here's some of this fiddleneck with its yellow flowers, beautiful thing, and some wild basil and hedge bedstraw, which are native, but this far north, they're often, you think maybe that's been planted or just sort of come in along on people's shoes or on cars or something like that, you know. But still nice to see and kind of enriching the local flora here. Fodder burnet, which is kind of like a salad burnet, but was grown for fodder. That's the one on the left, and some muskmallow on the right. This is all in the same little spot, really, which has obviously been subject to ongoing disturbance, as you can see from that trolley. But still, such an interesting flora, a mix of native and all these kind of non-native things. I find it much more exciting to see these non-native plants outside gardens than within gardens. Same place, just a bit further along, we met up with our friend Kevin, who's a sort of historian, really, but very keen on plants. This is all in Edinburgh, and an interesting wetland there. So great range of habitats, even at the broad habitat level, very varied. Another time we met up with our friend Mike and went out for a day looking at a site on the edge of Edinburgh, and there's some of this kind of what they call wildflower mix, which isn't really, but I suppose they look kind of attractive, but permanent pasture is obviously more ecologically better. Well, in an urban setting, it doesn't matter as much as it would in a rural one. Some more things here, tall melilot and sunspurge, just scrappy looking things by the edge of the curb, but that has its own interest. They don't have to look really pretty and wonderful. And some of them do get bigger though and form proper stands of vegetation, or get mixed in with bigger, well-developed vegetation like this Himalayan honeysuckle and the rayed tansy. So it's nice to see kind of vegetation of a kind of urban vegetation type that's not just scattered plants, but they're thickening up. The dwarf bamboo does it in a few places, which reminds me of some woodland in Japan where I was. It's another thing I like about some of these urban places. They can bring to mind other parts of the world. In a place near Edinburgh, we saw some ostrich ferns, and I thought, yeah, I've seen that in Japan as well. It's like little glimpses of the wonders of the wider world being brought to us. And odd things, I'd never heard of this until we saw it near Whitburn. It's like a bramble thing with prickles going the wrong way, bent upwards instead of down. And the white stem bramble, the stems aren't really white, but those prickles are extraordinary. This is near the end now. Alien invasives, yeah, they had to include some of those. Giant hogweed, and the Japanese knotweed, obviously things that would be NPMS negative indicators if you found them on a site. A Himalayan balsam, it's a grand looking plant, but yeah, it can be very invasive. And that Japanese rose can be as well. Well, these things do look quite attractive. The hybrid bluebell, actually they're saying now that maybe it's less of a problem than we thought, which is good. But yeah, it's mostly confined to more urban or semi sort of urban places, not getting out into places where there's lots and lots of wild bluebell in the hills. And that yellow archangel, that garden form with the variegated leaves, that can form dense patches. as well. I'm skipping through these fairly quick now. We're near the end. And all this stuff can inspire us to draw pictures. I put that picture there because it's what people might think is one of the most uninspired looking drawings that one might feel moved to do, but then I am drawn to such places, partly for their plants and just the urban landscape. I just like these scenes rather than the pretty cottagey things. I don't find so drawn to those. That's the last picture, a picture of a wee tiny little sunflower that we found at the site on the edge of Edinburgh. Beautiful little thing. There's something about that just makes you think that's come from somewhere obviously really different to around here or anywhere in Britain really. I don't know where, but it's like it's bringing a bit of tropical kind of sunny something to us in a very positive way. And that's the last picture, apart from that one there.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was so interesting. And as you say, it's so interesting when you are walking along and something like that stops you in your tracks. Now I'm super aware of the time. This session does finish in 2 minutes time, and I'm sure folk will have somewhere they need to go, but there is 2 minutes if anybody does have any questions they would just like to pop in the chat there. We did have one a little while back, but I didn't feel I could jump in at that point. It was regarding seed sources, and somebody was asking if the vegetation community that develops after the disturbance can be classified as a semi-natural one. Is it safe to assume that it existed before the disturbance?
I think very often it won't have existed before the disturbance. We can't always be sure about that, but in many places it is likely that it wouldn't have. Like kind of species-rich, herb-rich, neutral grassland is one. We don't always know what was there before. It might have been woodland before the industrial workings, say. I don't know, when it gets really well developed, you can get really good stands of really rich grassland. It's basically the same vegetation, the same species mix as we would see in some other place where it would class as lowland meadow kind of UK biodiversity action plan priority type, So maybe it's just a matter of time. I'd not heard of any particular number of years, but I think if it gets to that proper development of vegetation, then I think it should be at least afforded the respect and the protection and the appreciation. But and it does get a lot of protection in some places because they are nature reserves as well. So it's good vegetation. I don't downgrade it just because it's secondary.
Oh, brilliant, thank you. And one request here, somebody has asked regarding the place. It was a quarry, then a reservoir, and it's now a nature reserve near Bathgate. Somebody's asking for a bit more detail as to where it is, please. I think you've struck it in.
It's a place called Peters Hill, which is near Bathgate in West Lothian. It's just on the eastern edge, just out on the eastern side. I think it's the eastern side of Bathgate, the town of Bathgate.
Brilliant. So if you're near there, that's the name of the place. Thank you.
Scottish Wildlife Trust Reserve. Scottish Wildlife.
Oh, that's helpful to know. That's good. That'll be easy to search and find then. So brilliant. Just want to echo a load of, I can see lots and lots of comments flying through the chat now, just echoing my thoughts really, Ben. Thank you so much. It's lovely to see so much enthusiasm and interest for urban wild plants. We don't talk about them all that often within NPMS, so it's really lovely to hear. Lots of lovely thanks for such an interesting presentation. And actually that's timed so beautifully because it's now just gone 1:30. So I do hope you all enjoyed the session. That was amazingly done. And as I say, just to remind you that this has been recorded. So if you do want to take a look later, it'll be on the YouTube channel, the NPMS Support YouTube channel. But also we've got more webinars coming up in January and February. So do take a look at the NPMS website and our training and resources page. And do keep an eye out for the winter newsletter, which should be out by the end of this month. So do sign up to receive that if you're not already. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you all have, if I don't see you beforehand, I hope you all have a lovely Christmas and New Year period, and I look forward to seeing everybody in the new year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks so much, everybody else. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Bye.